Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, psychological, or professional relationship advice. The historical trends and case studies discussed regarding 1990s American divorce culture are intended for analytical review and should not be used as a basis for personal legal decisions. We strongly advise all viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with a qualified legal professional regarding family law matters in their specific jurisdiction. In 1992, Vice President Dan Quayle stood before a crowd in San Francisco and launched a cultural firestorm that would define a decade. He wasn't talking about tax code or foreign policy. He was attacking a fictional television character named Murphy Brown. Why? Because she chose to have a child without a husband. At that exact moment, America was reeling from a divorce rate that had effectively doubled since the 1960s, peaking at a level that suggested 1 out of every 2 marriages would end in a courtroom. We weren't just a nation in transition. We were a nation in a full-blown identity crisis. The 1990s represented the divorce now era, a period where the social stigma of marital dissolution finally crumbled, replaced by a complex, often contradictory landscape of no-fault legalities, latchkey kids, and a media machine that couldn't stop staring at the wreckage. If you look at the data, the 1990s was the decade where the split became a standard American rite of passage. But why did it happen then? And more importantly, how did the shift from staying for the kids to leaving for yourself fundamentally rewire the American psyche? Today, we are performing a deep dive autopsy on the 1990s divorce theme. We are going to unpack the legislative shifts that made walking away easier than ever, the cinematic obsession with the broken home, and the rise of a multi-billion-dollar divorce industrial complex. By the end of this masterclass, you will understand how the 1990s didn't just normalize divorce, it packaged it as a necessary step toward self-actualization, a move that still dictates how we view relationships, individual happiness, and the structure of the American family today. To understand the 1990s, we first have to look at the legal architecture that preceded it. While no-fault divorce laws began appearing in the 1970s, starting with California in 1969, it took nearly 20 years for these legal ripples to become a tidal wave in the public consciousness. Before this, you had to prove fault. You needed evidence of adultery, cruelty, or abandonment. This created a culture of the great lie, where couples would manufacture drama or hire private investigators just to secure a legal exit. By the time we reached 1990, the legal friction had largely vanished in most states. The barrier to entry for a divorce was no longer a moral or legal gauntlet. It was a paperwork exercise. This shift moved the concept of marriage from a covenant to a contract, one that could be terminated by either party at will. This legal ease triggered a massive demographic shift. In the early 90s, the United States saw a divorce rate hovering around 4.7 per 1,000 total population. While that number began a very slow decline toward the end of the decade, the raw volume of people affected was staggering. We weren't just seeing young couples splitting up. We were seeing the silver divorce trend take root, where couples who had been together for 20 or 30 years decided they no longer recognized the person across the breakfast table. The 1990 census was a wake-up call, showing that the number of divorced people in the U.S. had quadrupled since 1970. This statistical reality bled directly into the living rooms of every American through the medium of the sitcom. Think about the landscape of 90s television. We moved away from the nuclear perfection of the 1950s and 60s and even the 80s Cosby era. Suddenly, the most popular shows on television were centered around the aftermath of marital collapse, or the avoidance of it. Take Friends, which premiered in 1994. The very pilot episode begins with Rachel Green fleeing her wedding and Ross Geller mourning his first divorce. The entire premise of the show, that your friends are your new family, was a direct response to the perceived instability of the biological family unit. The divorce now theme wasn't just about the act of leaving. It was about the restructuring of childhood. The 1990s was the era of the latchkey kid. With divorce rates high and the rise of dual-income households, millions of children were returning to empty homes. This created a unique cultural friction. On one hand, you had a generation of parents seeking individual fulfillment, a buzzword of 90s therapy culture. On the other, you had a generation of children navigating binuclear families, a term coined to describe the two-house, two-holiday, two-personality life of the child of divorce. The media didn't just report on this, it obsessed over it. Look at the 1993 film Mrs. Doubtfire. On the surface, it's a high-concept comedy about a father dressing up as a nanny. But at its core, it is a deeply somber exploration of a father's desperation to maintain a connection with his children after a no-fault split. The film was a massive commercial success because it tapped into a collective anxiety. It acknowledged a truth that 1990s parents were struggling with. The legal system might make the divorce easy, but the emotional logistics were a nightmare. The movie notably does not end with the parents getting back together. A radical departure from Hollywood tropes. This signaled a shift in American storytelling. We were no longer interested in the happy ending of reconciliation. We were learning to accept the healthy ending of a functional, though fractured, co-parenting arrangement. We also have to discuss the economic engine behind this theme. The 1990s saw the professionalization of the divorce process, mediation services, specialized child psychologists, and a booming market for self-help books like Waiting to Exhale, or The Good Divorce created a roadmap for the transition. Divorce was no longer a private shame discussed in hushed tones. It was a lifestyle transition supported by an industry. This was the decade of the divorce party, beginning to surface in urban centers. It was the decade where self-care began to be marketed as a reason to end a stagnant marriage. The cultural conversation was further polarized by political figures. When Dan Quayle attacked Murphy Brown, he was leaning into family values rhetoric that attempted to shame the divorce now mentality. This created a massive cultural divide between the traditionalists, who saw the rising divorce rate as the moral decay of America, and the modernists, who saw it as a victory for women's autonomy and individual liberty. Women in the 90s were more economically empowered than any generation prior. They had the financial means to leave unhappy or abusive situations, a factor that is often overlooked when critics lament the death of the family. The 1990s divorce theme was, in many ways, a byproduct of the 1970s feminist movement finally reaching economic maturity. The stakes of this era were incredibly high. For the first time, a large portion of the American population was wondering, is the traditional family unit obsolete? If half of us are failing at it, why do we keep doing it? This led to the cynical 90s vibe, a pervasive sense of irony and skepticism toward institutions. You can see this in the music of the era, particularly in grunge and alt-rock, where themes of abandonment and broken homes were prevalent in the lyrics of bands like Nirvana and Everclear. By analyzing this decade, we aren't just looking at history. We are looking at the foundation of our current social contracts. The 1990s taught us that the pursuit of personal happiness is the ultimate American right, even if that pursuit requires the dismantling of a household. It set the stage for the diverse family structures we see today, from blended families to co-parenting partnerships. We are going to break down exactly how the legal, social, and economic factors of the 90s converged to create this divorce now phenomenon, and we will examine the case studies of the high-profile splits that captivated the nation and changed the way we think about "till death do us part." To understand how the divorce now mentality shifted from a private legal matter to a public spectacle, we have to examine the catalyst that turned the 1990s into a decade of voyeuristic marital collapse. Imagine it is the mid-90s, and you are sitting in a suburban living room in Ohio. The evening news isn't just reporting on policy. It is providing a play-by-play analysis of the most expensive and vitriolic legal battles in American history. This was the era where the celebrity divorce became a teaching tool for the masses. It wasn't just gossip. It was a demonstration of how the new legal frameworks we discussed in the last section were being stress-tested in real time. Take, for example, the highly publicized split of Donald and Ivana Trump, which technically finalized in 1992, but haunted the cultural zeitgeist for the rest of the decade. This case study is pivotal because it introduced the American public to the concept of the post-nuptial agreement and the strategic use of the media as a weapon in domestic litigation. This wasn't a quiet dissolution. It was a multi-front war that utilized tabloid headlines as leverage. For the average American viewer, this signaled a massive shift. Marriage was no longer a sacred, private bond, but a public negotiation of assets and brand identity. This case study proved that in the 1990s, if you were unhappy, you didn't just leave. You rebranded. But it wasn't just the billionaires. The 1990s was the decade where the royal family of the United Kingdom, the ultimate symbols of traditional marital stability, fractured in front of a global audience. The separation and subsequent 1996 divorce of Prince Charles and Princess Diana acted as a global masterclass in the breakdown of the nuclear family. When Diana sat down for her 1995 Panorama interview and famously stated there were 3 people in the marriage, she wasn't just talking about infidelity. She was articulating a core 90s sentiment: the refusal to suffer in silence for the sake of an institution. This resonated deeply with American audiences who were already grappling with high divorce rates. If the future King of England couldn't make a traditional marriage work under the pressure of global scrutiny, then the average person in Kansas felt a sudden, profound permission to prioritize their own emotional health over social expectations. Historical trends show that these high-profile case studies created a psychological permission structure. Before the 90s, divorce was often seen as a failure of character. By 1995, it was increasingly viewed as a lifestyle choice. This led to a phenomenon we call the contagion effect. When people see public figures navigating the complexities of split custody and asset division, it demystifies the process. It makes the unthinkable seem manageable. Let's look at the data of the mid-90s to see how this translated to the average household. By 1996, the United States Census Bureau reported that approximately 1 in 3 children were living with a parent who had been divorced. This meant that the split was no longer an outlier experience. It was the majority experience in many school districts. This led to the rise of the divorce recovery industry. Imagine if you were a therapist in 1997. Your office would be flooded not with couples trying to save their marriage, but with individuals asking how to uncouple with the least amount of trauma. The market responded with a deluge of literature. Books like The Good Divorce by Constance Arons argued that divorce didn't have to be a catastrophe. It could be a transition to a binuclear family. This was a revolutionary and controversial idea that fundamentally changed the way 90s parents viewed their responsibilities. Step by step, the culture was being re-engineered to accept the temporary nature of modern relationships. The first step was the removal of the legal barrier, which we've covered. The second step, which peaked in the mid-90s, was the removal of the social barrier through media saturation. The third step was the commodification of the exit. We saw the emergence of the celebrity divorce attorney as a new kind of folk hero. Figures like Samantha Singer or the real-life inspirations for the characters in 1990 SIXS, the First Wives Club became symbols of empowerment. The First Wives Club is a perfect cultural artifact to analyze here. It wasn't just a movie. It was a revenge fantasy that grossed over $180 million. It depicted 3 women who were traded in for younger models and decided to take everything from their ex-husbands. This film highlighted a very specific 1990s anxiety, the fear of the disposable spouse. As the divorce now theme took hold, a new fear emerged. Not that you would be trapped in a bad marriage, but that you would be discarded by a partner who was constantly looking for a software upgrade in their personal life. This leads us to a critical turning point in our analysis. While the 90s marketed divorce as a path to freedom, the economic reality for many was far more grim. Historical trends from the era show a significant disparity in the post-divorce standard of living between men and women. Studies from the mid-90s suggested that a woman's standard of living dropped by an average of 27% after a divorce, while a man's often rose. This created a paradoxical culture. We were celebrating the freedom to leave in our movies and music, but the actual data showed that for many, especially those in the middle and working classes, divorce was a fast track to financial instability. In 2026, looking back at this era, we can see how this shaped our current definitions of success. In the 90s, a successful person was someone who could navigate a divorce and come out winning the settlement. It was the era of winning the divorce. This mindset shifted the focus from the collective health of the family to the individual optimization of the self. We started seeing the rise of parenting plans and mediated settlements as the new standard of domestic life. But there was a darker side to this normalization that the 90s media rarely touched upon until the very end of the decade. This was the impact on the silent generation of the 90s, the children who were the primary subjects of these new co-parenting experiments. As we move into the next phase of this deep dive, we have to ask, what happened when the divorce now mantra met the reality of a generation raised in 2 houses? We've looked at the celebrities and the movies, but now we need to look at the psychological landscape of the children who were told that, if mom and dad are happy, you'll be happy. Was that actually true? Or was it the greatest marketing lie of the 20th century? We are about to look at the longitudinal studies that started in the 90s and are only now giving us the full picture of the Divorce Now legacy. And more importantly, we're going to look at the one specific film released in 1998 that finally pulled back the curtain on the perfectly managed divorce and showed the world the messy, uncoordinated truth of what was happening behind those suburban doors. If you think the 90s was just about freedom, wait until you see the data on the long-term emotional potential outcomes for the kids who lived through it. The shift from the parent-centric liberation of the early 90s to the child-centric anxiety of the late 90s can be traced through a very specific change in scientific literature and media portrayal. To understand this, we have to look at the emergence of the long-term effects study. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, the prevailing psychological wisdom was the crisis model. This theory suggested that divorce was a temporary crisis, like a severe bout of the flu, and that after a year or two of adjustment, children would return to a baseline of normalcy. However, by the mid to late 90s, researchers like Judith Wallerstein began publishing findings that challenged this entire narrative. Her work, which culminated in high-profile 1990s discussions, suggested that for children, divorce wasn't a temporary event, but a life-altering trajectory with a sleeper effect that wouldn't fully manifest until they reached adulthood themselves. Imagine if you are a 10-year-old in 1998, living in a house in a quiet cul-de-sac. Your parents have mastered the art of the 1990s civil divorce. There are no screaming matches, no broken plates, just 2 separate calendars and a carefully negotiated schedule for the holidays. On paper, you are the success story of the divorce now era. But in reality, you are performing a constant act of emotional translation. You are moving between 2 different sets of house rules, 2 different social circles, and 2 different versions of the truth. This was the birth of the divided self. The 1990s culture told these children they were resilient, but the data starting to emerge in that decade suggested that this resilience was often a mask for a profound sense of loss. A pivotal case study in this cultural shift is the 1998 film The Parent Trap. While technically a remake of a 1961 classic, the 1990s version directed by Nancy Meyers spoke to a very specific 90s fantasy, the dream of the parent trap itself. For a generation of children experiencing the divorce now theme, the idea that their parents' split was just a giant misunderstanding that could be fixed through child-led intervention was the ultimate coping mechanism. The film was a massive hit because it played into the deep-seated desire for reunification in an era where the adults were doubling down on the necessity of separation. It highlighted the massive gap between the adult pursuit of self-actualization and the child's pursuit of stability. But let us look at the harder data from the era. By the late 1990s, the National Survey of Families and Households provided a sobering look at the potential outcomes for what were then called broken homes. Historical trends indicated that children from divorced families were statistically more likely to experience academic struggles, early entry into the workforce, and ironically, a higher likelihood of their own marriages ending in divorce later in life. This created the cycle of the 1990s heritage. We weren't just looking at a few million people getting divorced. We were watching the fundamental restructuring of the American social fabric for the next 50 years. Step by step, the late 90s began to process the bill for the early 90s party. Step 1 was the realization that money doesn't buy stability. Even in affluent suburbs, the rise of the latchkey phenomenon led to a surge in teenage rebellion and substance use as a form of self-medication for the instability at home. Step 2 was the academic pivot. Schools began introducing divorce groups for kids, effectively institutionalizing the split as a standard part of the American educational experience. Step 3 was the shift in how we viewed the stay-at-home parent. In a divorce-prone culture, the risk of being a non-working spouse became a central theme of 1990s financial advice columns. Women were increasingly warned that a marriage was not a retirement plan, which further pushed the dual-income, high-stress household model into the mainstream. In the year 2026, we see the children of the 1990s, now the primary drivers of the economy and the leaders of their own families, exhibiting a very specific set of behaviors rooted in this era. This generation, often referred to as the bridge between the analog and digital worlds, is also the bridge between the old-school nuclear family and the modern fluid family. They are the ones who pioneered the concept of the prenuptial agreement not as a sign of distrust, but as a standard safety protocol. They grew up watching the Divorce Now theme play out on their television screens and in their own kitchens, and as a result, they became the most relationship-cautious generation in American history. The 1990s also saw the rise of a specific type of media protagonist, the jaded, cynical child who is more mature than their parents. Think of the character of Kevin McAllister in Home Alone, or the various children in 1990s family dramedies. These characters weren't just funny, they were archetypes of the 1990s condition. They were children who had to navigate the adult world because the adult world was too busy navigating its own emotional liberation. This was the era where the parent-child hierarchy began to blur. As parents sought to be friends with their children to ease the guilt of the divorce, the traditional boundaries of the American home dissolved. To understand the full depth of this, we have to look at the intersection of divorce and the burgeoning internet culture of the late 1990s. As the Divorce Now theme hit its peak, the first chat rooms and support forums began to appear. People were no longer limited to the advice of their local priest or their neighbor. They were finding a global community of people who were also walking away. This digital acceleration of the split meant that the social pressure to stay together was being eroded by a new, online community that prioritized individual happiness above all else. But there was a counter-movement brewing. By 1999, as the millennium approached, a wave of social conservatism began to push back against the Divorce Now trend. This led to the rise of covenant marriage in states like Louisiana and Arizona, a legal attempt to make divorce harder to get. This legislative pushback showed that the nation was deeply divided. We were a country that loved the idea of freedom, but was increasingly terrified of the consequences of that freedom. If we look at the case study of 1990s Nashville, Tennessee, we see a fascinating microcosm of this tension. It was a hub for both traditional family-centric country music and a rapidly modernizing urban population. The music coming out of Nashville in the late 90s reflected this perfectly. Songs began to move away from the simple "he cheated, she left" narrative and into complex explorations of the fatigue and the gray areas of long-term commitment. The culture was exhausted. The high-octane drama of the early 90s celebrity splits had given way to a weary realization that starting over was incredibly hard work. The question then became, if the Divorce Now era was based on the idea that people would be happier once they were free, why did the late 90s feel so anxious? Why did the rate of clinical depression and the sales of antidepressants like Prozac skyrocket alongside the divorce rate? We have to examine the possibility that the 1990s sold us a version of happiness that was physically and emotionally unsustainable. As we move into the next part of this deep dive, we are going to look at the specific psychological phenomenon of the 1990s starter marriage. This was the decade where the idea of a practice marriage became a legitimate social concept. Why were 20-somethings in the 90s getting married and divorced with the same frequency that people today change their subscription services? And what happens when we look at the actual cost, not just in dollars but in the psychological capital of a nation? We are moving from the impact on the children to the impact on the young adults of the 90s, the ones who were supposed to be the new leaders of the American family. We are going to uncover the hidden economic impact of the 1990s divorce boom that led directly to the housing and lifestyle shifts of the early 2000s. The math behind the heartbreak is more calculated than you think. The rise of the starter marriage in the 1990s was not merely a punchline for late-night talk show hosts. It was a socio-economic shift that redefined the early adult years of Gen X. A starter marriage is typically defined as a first marriage that lasts 5 years or less and ends before the couple has children. In the mid-90s, this became a statistical focal point. Historical trends indicated that young adults were rushing into matrimony as a way to establish adulthood, only to find that the Divorce Now infrastructure made the exit strategy more appealing than the maintenance of the union. Imagine if you are a 24-year-old marketing assistant in Chicago in 1994. You have the wedding, the registry at Crate and Barrel, and the shared apartment. But within 36 months, you realize that the cultural premium on individual growth makes the compromise of marriage feel like a cage. In previous decades, you might have stayed out of social obligation. In the 90s, you looked at the sheer volume of peers doing the same thing and realized that a mistake at 25 was no longer a life sentence. This created a massive secondary economic market. The 1990s saw the explosion of the studio apartment and the one-bedroom condo market in urban centers like Atlanta, Seattle, and Denver. The math was simple. For every divorce, one household became two. This doubled the demand for consumer durables: 2 refrigerators, 2 televisions, 2 sets of furniture. Economists of the era noted that the divorce boom was, ironically, a significant driver of retail growth. The Divorce Now theme was effectively subsidized by the booming 90s economy. Because the Clinton-era economy was surging, the financial sting of a starter marriage failure was mitigated by high employment rates and rising wages. You could afford to be single again. This economic cushion allowed the psychological trend to accelerate, because the potential outcomes of a split didn't immediately result in poverty for the young, college-educated demographic. Let us look at the case study of the 1990s romantic comedy as a recruitment tool for this mindset. Films like My Best Friend's Wedding or Jerry Maguire didn't just showcase romance. They showcased the high-stakes, high-velocity nature of 90s relationships. Jerry Maguire, released in 1996, is particularly telling. The marriage happens almost as an impulse, a reaction to a shared moment of professional crisis, and the rest of the film is a grueling negotiation of whether they even like each other. The famous line, "You complete me," was a double-edged sword. It placed an impossible burden on the partner to be the sole source of existential fulfillment. When the partner inevitably failed to provide total completion, the divorce now exit was the logical conclusion. This was the era of the soulmate or bust mentality. Step by step, the starter marriage became a recognized developmental stage. Step 1 was the performative wedding. The 90s saw the birth of the wedding industrial complex, where the average cost of a wedding began to outpace the rate of inflation. Step 2 was the domestic realization. Young couples, influenced by the rapid-fire consumerism of the decade, often found that the reality of bill paying and dishwashing didn't match the cinematic expectations of their youth. Step 3 was the low-friction split. Without children or significant shared assets like a multi-year mortgage, these couples utilized the streamlined legal processes to revert to single status before they hit 30. This created a new social class, the young divorcee. Unlike the divorcees of the 1970s, this group carried very little stigma. They were seen as savvy, having tested the waters of matrimony and decided to pivot. But what did this do to the concept of trust? If we look at the year 2026, we see the echoes of this starter marriage era in the way current relationships are structured. The 1990s taught us that everything is negotiable and everything is temporary. This led to a hyper-individualistic approach to finance. The rise of separate bank accounts, even within a marriage, can be traced back to the cautionary tales of the 90s. People began to enter marriages with an eye on the exit, not out of malice, but out of a perceived need for self-preservation. Historical trends show that by 1998, the number of prenuptial agreements being signed by non-wealthy couples had increased significantly. It was no longer just for the Trumps of the world. It was for the middle-class professional who didn't want to lose their 401k if the starter marriage didn't start. Imagine if the 1990s hadn't been an era of economic prosperity. If the country had been in a deep depression, would the divorce now theme have been as prevalent? Likely not. Divorce is an expensive luxury. It requires the ability to support two households on the same total income pool. The 1990s housing bubble, the early stages of it, allowed people to use the equity in their homes to fund their legal battles and their new separate lives. This was the dark side of the 90s boom. It made the destruction of the family unit financially viable. We must also consider the role of the 1990s workplace. This was the decade of the 80-hour work week and the rise of the Silicon Valley culture. As people spent more time with their colleagues than their spouses, the workplace became a primary site for marital friction. The work-life balance didn't exist, it was all work. This contributed to the emotional distance that made the divorce now theme feel like a relief rather than a tragedy. When your office provides the community, the snacks, and the social life, the home becomes merely a place where you sleep and argue about chores. The case study of the dot-com boom and bust provides numerous examples of marriages that were fueled by IPO paper wealth and collapsed the moment the stock price dipped below the cost of the mortgage. The 1990s also saw a shift in the religious response to divorce. While traditional denominations still officially frowned upon it, many suburban megachurches began to offer divorce recovery workshops. This was a pragmatic move. If they didn't accommodate the divorced, they would lose half their congregation. By integrating the divorced into the church social structure, they unintentionally helped to normalize the state. This removed one of the final barriers to the Divorce Now movement, the fear of spiritual exile. Now you could get divorced on Tuesday and be at a singles ministry mixer on Friday. As we move toward the end of the century in our analysis, we see the theme of the midlife crisis being replaced by the quarter-life crisis. The 1990s made it okay to be lost in your 20s, and divorce was often the catalyst for a radical change in career or location. But there is a hidden cost to this constant pivoting. The math behind the heartbreak reveals a massive loss in generational wealth. Every time a household splits, the ability to save and invest is diminished. The 1990s boom masked this, but as we look back from 2026, we can see that the divorce boom of that decade is one of the primary reasons for the wealth gap we see today between those who maintain stable households and those who move through a series of starter marriages. This brings us to a massive open loop in our deep dive. While the adults were busy reinventing themselves and the young professionals were treating marriage like a trial subscription, something was happening in the background of American law. A new kind of litigation was emerging, one that didn't just target the spouse, but targeted the third parties involved in the breakdown of the marriage. And at the same time, the pharmaceutical industry was about to release a new wave of medications that would change the way we treated the emotional fallout of the Divorce Now era. Was the 90s divorce rate a result of social change? Or was it a result of a nation that was increasingly being medicated to handle the stress of a crumbling social structure? In the next part, we're going to look at the medicalization of the split and the rise of the alienation of affection lawsuits that turned the divorce now theme into a legal thriller. The intersection of Prozac and the courtroom is where the 90s truly gets dark. As we move into the second half of the 1990s, the divorce now theme collided with a medical revolution that changed the very chemistry of the American household. This was the era of the SSRI, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. When Prozac appeared on the cover of Newsweek in 1990 and later inspired the best-selling memoir Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel in 1994, it signaled a shift in how Americans managed the emotional volatility of a crumbling marriage. We have to examine the possibility that the clinical management of depression actually accelerated the divorce rate. In previous decades, a spouse might stay in a dead marriage because they lacked the emotional energy to leave. By the mid-90s, pharmacological intervention provided many with the newfound agency and stability required to navigate the grueling legal process of a split. The historical trends show a direct correlation between the rise of antidepressant prescriptions and the increase in individuals seeking out domestic mediation. Imagine if you are a mother of 3 in a suburb of Atlanta in 1996. You have been living in a state of low-grade marital dissatisfaction for a decade. In 1980, you might have been told to endure it. But in 1996, your primary care physician presents you with a pharmaceutical option that promises to level out your emotional lows. Suddenly, the fog lifts. With that clarity comes a realization. You no longer have to tolerate a partnership that doesn't serve your individual growth. This created a unique 1990s paradox. We were medicating people to help them stay functional, but that very functionality gave them the strength to dismantle their families. This wasn't just a side effect. It was the new cultural baseline. The medicalization of the split meant that the pain of divorce was no longer seen as a moral failing, but as a manageable clinical condition. Step by step, the courtroom began to mirror this medicalized reality. We saw the rise of the forensic psychologist in child custody cases. Step 1. A couple would file for a no-fault divorce. Step 2. When the mediation failed, the court would appoint a mental health professional to perform a 730 evaluation. Step 3. The intimate details of a family's emotional life were converted into a clinical report used to determine the best interests of the child. This was a radical departure from the 1970s, where custody was almost always granted to the mother. In the 1990s, the battle for custody became a war of psychological testing and professional testimony. This created the divorce industrial complex, a network of lawyers, therapists, and evaluators who all had a financial stake in the prolongation of marital conflict. But while the internal family unit was being analyzed by doctors, the legal system was reviving a ghost from the past: the alienation of affection lawsuit. While most of America was moving toward no-fault settlements, several states, including North Carolina and Mississippi, saw a surge in these heart-bomb torts. This allowed a jilted spouse to sue a third party, the person who supposedly lured their partner away, for the loss of love and companionship. In the late 90s, these cases began to result in multi-million-dollar judgments. One of the most famous case studies involved a North Carolina woman in 1997 who was awarded over $1 million after suing her husband's mistress. This created a fascinating legal friction in the divorce now era. On one hand, the law said no one was at fault. On the other hand, the law was increasingly willing to put a massive price tag on the destruction of a marriage if a third party was involved. This led to a culture of surveillance. The 1990s was the golden age of the private investigator. Before everyone had a GPS tracker in their pocket, spouses were hiring professionals to hide in bushes and take grainier photos of illicit meetings. This was the dark underbelly of the divorce now theme. It wasn't all about empowerment and moving on. It was often about digital and physical stalking. The technology of the 90s, pagers, early cell phones, and shared home computers became the primary evidence in these battles. Imagine a 1998 scenario where a husband discovers an AOL chat room log on the family computer. That single text file became a lethal weapon in a custody battle, even in states that claimed to be no fault. The data was the new high ground. In the year 2026, we look back at this as the beginning of the end of privacy in relationships. The 90s taught us that your private thoughts, once digitized or shared with a third party, belonged to the court. This fear fueled a specific type of 90s paranoia that bled into the entertainment of the time. Think of the 1992 film Unfaithful, or the 1994 thriller Disclosure. These movies weren't just about sex. They were about the absolute destruction of a person's life through the intersection of infidelity and the legal system. The stakes were no longer just emotional. They were total. You could lose your house, your kids, and your reputation in a single afternoon. The case study of the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995 also played a massive, though often overlooked, role in the Divorce Now theme. While it was primarily a trial about murder and race, the subtext that captivated the American public was the history of domestic abuse and the failure of the legal system to protect a woman trying to navigate a high-stakes divorce. It forced a conversation about the difference between a civil split and a dangerous one. It led to the passage and strengthening of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, which provided new legal frameworks for women to leave abusive marriages. This was the moment the public realized that for some, divorce now wasn't a choice about self-actualization. It was a matter of survival. This era also saw a rise in what sociologists call the uncoupling of assets. As the 90s bull market continued, the division of stock options and 401ks became more complex than the division of the furniture. We saw the emergence of the QDRO, or Qualified Domestic Relations Order. This was a legal mechanism that allowed for the tax-free transfer of retirement funds between spouses during a divorce. For the first time, a stay-at-home parent could walk away with a guaranteed portion of a future pension. This financial security acted as a silent engine for the divorce rate. When the math showed that you could survive independently, the emotional cost of staying became higher than the financial cost of leaving. But what about the people who couldn't afford the lawyers and the psychologists? The 1990s Divorce Now theme had a massive class divide. For the wealthy, it was a managed transition. For the working class, it often meant a descent into a cycle of poverty and transient living. The historical trends from 1990 to 1999 show that the gap in marital stability between those with a college degree and those without began to widen into a canyon. This created a two-tiered society, one where marriage was a stable foundation for wealth building, and another where the cycle of the split became a permanent obstacle to economic mobility. We have to ask ourselves, was the 90s obsession with the split a sign of a society becoming more honest, or was it a sign of a society losing its ability to resolve conflict? As we move into the next part of this series, we are going to look at the rise of the divorce party and the commercialization of the breakup. We will explore how the 90s turned a tragedy into a marketing opportunity, and how a specific group of entrepreneurs began to realize that there was more money to be made in a nation of single people than in a nation of families. But before we get there, we need to address the most controversial part of the 90s divorce landscape: the rise of the parental alienation syndrome. Was it a legitimate psychological discovery? Or was it a legal weapon invented to silence children? The answer lies in a series of court cases from 1999 that still haunt our legal system in 2026. The true cost of the 90s wasn't found in the legal fees. It was found in the silence of the children who were told to choose a side. The concept of parental alienation syndrome, or PAS, emerged as one of the most toxic and debated legal strategies of the late 1990s. To understand its impact, we have to look at the work of Richard Gardner, a child psychiatrist whose theories became the nuclear option in high-conflict custody battles. PAS was described as a process where one parent, usually the custodial parent, systematically brainwashed the child to reject the other parent. While it never gained official recognition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, its influence in the 1990s courtroom was absolute. It turned the Divorce Now theme from a pursuit of freedom into a psychological war of attrition. Imagine if you are a family court judge in 1999. You are faced with a child who adamantly refuses to visit their father. In 1975, you might have taken that child's word at face value. But in 1999, the introduction of PAS meant that the child's testimony was now viewed through a lens of suspicion. The logic was circular. The more a child expressed hatred for a parent, the more it proved they were being manipulated. This led to a series of controversial court-ordered reunification programs, where children were forcibly removed from the home they knew and sent to re-education camps to bond with the rejected parent. These cases, which peaked in the final years of the decade, represent the most extreme potential outcomes of the 1990s divorce obsession. We weren't just splitting assets anymore. We were attempting to litigate the very contents of a child's heart. This legal shift created a massive ripple effect in 1990s parenting culture. Parents became hyper-aware of their image as a co-parent. Historical trends show that this was the era where parallel parenting and parenting coordinators became standard features of the American legal landscape. Step by step, the intimacy of the family was replaced by a bureaucratic oversight. Step 1. The initial filing. Step 2. The appointment of a guardian ad litem, an attorney specifically for the child. Step 3. The monitoring of phone calls and visitation by third-party supervisors. By the year 1999, the normal divorce for a middle-class American family often involved at least 5 different professionals hovering over the dinner table. While the courts were getting more clinical, the culture was getting more celebratory. The late 90s saw the birth of the divorce industrial complex's most flamboyant wing, the commercialization of the breakup. This was the era where the divorce party moved from an edgy urban legend to a mainstream retail category. Imagine if you are a party planner in 1998. You are no longer just booking weddings and bar mitzvahs. You are now being hired to organize freedom bashes, where the guest of honor ceremoniously burns their wedding dress or cuts the wedding cake in half with a chainsaw. This wasn't just a party. It was a ritual of excision. It was the public declaration that the divorce now mantra was a victory, not a tragedy. This commercialization extended to the greeting card aisle. Hallmark and other major retailers began testing lines of divorce encouragement cards. The messaging was clear. Congratulations on your new beginning, and the best is yet to come. By packaging divorce as a celebratory milestone, the market was reinforcing the idea that the nuclear family was a disposable commodity. This shift in the late 90s is critical because it changed the social cost of leaving. When your friends are throwing you a party and Hallmark is providing the stationery, the internal resistance to breaking a covenant is significantly lowered. The 1990s turned the split into a consumable experience. Let us look at a specific case study of this commercialization. The rise of the single mom as a distinct marketing demographic. In the 1950s, a single mother was a figure of pity or scandal. In the 1990s, she was a powerhouse consumer. Brands began to realize that the head of a single-parent household was the primary decision-maker for a massive pool of capital. Advertisements for cars, home security systems, and insurance began to feature the strong single mother archetype. This was a double-edged sword. While it provided much-needed visibility and empowerment for women navigating the 90s divorce wave, it also incentivized the lifestyle. The media machine told these women they didn't need a partner to have a full high-status life. In 2026, we can see how this marketing pivot paved the way for the individualist consumerism that dominates our current economy. However, the data from 1999 suggests that this celebratory veneer was masking a burgeoning crisis in American housing. The divorce now theme was a primary driver of suburban sprawl. When one household became 2, both parents often tried to stay within the same school district to maintain a semblance of stability for the kids. This doubled the demand for mid-sized suburban homes in specific zip codes, driving up property taxes and home prices. The divorce premium on real estate meant that the 1990s housing market was being artificially inflated by the fragmentation of the family. Economists have noted that the 2 household families of the 90s required more land, more energy, and more infrastructure than the nuclear families of the 80s. The environmental and economic footprint of the 1990s divorce was staggering. We also have to analyze the role of the expert in this era. The 1990s was the decade of the divorce guru. Figures like Dr. Phil, who rose to prominence on Oprah in the late 90s, became the national arbiters of marital health. Their advice often followed a specific 90s formula. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. This push for radical honesty often acted as the final nudge for people on the fence. The cultural permission to speak your truth became a mandate to leave any situation that felt restrictive. This led to a phenomenon where people weren't just divorcing their spouses, they were divorcing their past selves. The 1990s divorce was the ultimate act of self-help. But what happened when the truth was messy? The case study of 1990s daytime talk shows, Jerry Springer, Maury Povich, Jenny Jones, provides a darker look at the divorce now theme. These shows turned the breakdown of the working-class family into a blood sport. They showcased the unmanaged divorce, characterized by paternity tests, physical altercations, and raw, humiliated screaming. For the middle-class viewer, these shows acted as a cautionary tale. Get a good lawyer and a therapist, or you'll end up like this. It reinforced the idea that there was a right way to divorce, the expensive clinical way, and a wrong way, the loud public way. This further institutionalized the divorce industrial complex by making professional intervention feel like a survival necessity. In the year 2026, we see the long-term results of this professionalization. We are a society that is highly adept at managing relationships but perhaps less skilled at sustaining them. The 1990s taught us that if a relationship is hard, you bring in a consultant. If the consultant can't fix it, you bring in a liquidator. This corporate model of matrimony is the lasting legacy of the 1990s. We moved from the moral family to the therapeutic family, where the success of the unit is measured by the individual happiness of its members rather than the longevity of the institution. As we conclude this part of our deep dive, we have to look toward the horizon of the new millennium. By 1999, the first wave of internet infidelity was starting to hit the courts. The Divorce Now theme was about to be supercharged by a technology that made finding a replacement spouse as easy as clicking a button. We are going to explore how the rise of early dating sites and the digital affair turned the 1990s divorce wave into a permanent cultural feature. And we will look at the one specific 1999 event that proved, once and for all, that no matter how much we medicated, litigated, or celebrated it, the American heart was still profoundly unprepared for the reality of the permanent split. The transition from the 20th to the 21st century brought a new kind of grief technology that we are still trying to master today. The math of the 90s was about to meet the algorithm of the 2000s, and the family would never be the same. The year 1999 acted as a digital gateway for the Divorce Now theme, transforming a localized social trend into a global algorithmic reality. This was the year of the digital affair. Before high-speed internet was a household standard, the rise of services like AOL and early iterations of Classmates.com provided a playground for what sociologists call the emotional exit. In the early 90s, if you were unhappy in your marriage in a small town in Indiana, your options for a new partner were limited to your immediate physical geography. By 1999, the potential outcomes of a split were bolstered by the illusion of infinite choice. You were no longer just divorcing your spouse. You were moving toward a curated fantasy found in a chat room. Imagine if you are a 35-year-old accountant named Mark in 1999. Your marriage has settled into a comfortable but unexciting routine. You dial up your 56K modem and find a community of people who mirror your specific dissatisfaction. For the first time in history, the friction of finding a replacement partner was being digitized. This digital acceleration meant that the cooling-off period, which had naturally existed in the pre-internet era, was disappearing. People were making life-altering decisions to dismantle their families based on pixels and text strings. This led to a surge in what legal scholars of the time called internet-induced divorce. The case study of the film You Have Got Mail, released in late 1998, is a perfect lens for this. While the movie is framed as a whimsical romance, its subtext is about the obsolescence of current commitments in the face of digital connection. It popularized the idea that your true soulmate might be a stranger behind a screen name, rendering your physical partner a mere placeholder. For the American public, this reinforced the 1990s Divorce Now mantra. Why settle for the reality of a difficult marriage when the potential outcome of a digital romance is just a click away? This created a culture of perpetual comparison that we are still struggling with in 2026. Step by step, the technology of the late 90s began to automate the dissolution of the family. Step 1. The introduction of the shared home computer. This became the primary evidence locker for divorce attorneys. Step 2. The rise of electronic paper trails. Unlike a whispered phone call, an email was permanent and discoverable. Step 3. The democratization of legal information. Websites began to pop up that allowed people to download divorce papers and filing instructions for free. The gatekeepers of the legal profession were being bypassed. Divorce was becoming a DIY project, further lowering the barrier to entry for the split. Historical trends from 1999 indicate that this was the year the term gray divorce began to gain traction in demographic circles. While the media was obsessed with the starter marriages of 20-somethings, a significant number of people over the age of 50 were deciding that life was too short to spend the new millennium in a stale union. This generation had built significant home equity during the 90s boom. For them, the Divorce Now theme was funded by the rising value of their suburban properties. They weren't just leaving for a new person. They were leaving for a new identity, often selling the family home and downsizing to a condo in a warmer climate. This demographic shift had a massive impact on the healthcare and estate planning industries, as the single-person elderly household became a new American norm. But let us look at the psychological fallout of this digital shift. The late 90s saw the birth of the cyberstalker as a common figure in divorce litigation. When the split became digital, the harassment became 24/7. Historical trends show that the legal system was completely unprepared for this. There were no laws in 1999 that effectively dealt with someone flooding an ex-spouse email inbox or monitoring their activity on early social forums. This added a layer of high-tech trauma to the divorce now experience. The split was no longer a clean break. It was a digital haunting. In 2026, we see the children of these 1999 divorces as the primary architects of modern dating apps. They grew up in the shadow of the digital affair, and as a result, they have built a world where the search for a partner is entirely gamified. The 90s gave us the permission to leave. The 2000s gave us the tools to never stop looking. This is the ultimate legacy of the 1999 pivot. We moved from a society that sought to fix what was broken to a society that seeks to upgrade what is functioning. The economic data from the end of the decade also reveals a fascinating trend: the rise of the divorce real estate specialist. By 1999, real estate agents were getting certified in the specific logistics of selling a home during a contested split. They knew how to navigate the court orders, how to deal with two different attorneys, and how to stage a home so that it didn't look like a war zone. This was a clear sign that the divorce now theme was no longer a cultural outlier. It was a core driver of the American economy. The fragmentation of the household was a profitable enterprise for everyone except the family itself. Consider the case study of the 1999 phenomenon, The Sopranos. While it is remembered as a mob drama, its core engine is the analysis of a crumbling traditional family structure in a modern therapeutic world. Tony Soprano's panic attacks are a direct result of the friction between his old-world values and the new-world reality where his children are questioning everything and his wife is contemplating a legal exit. The show resonated because it depicted the 1990s American male's existential dread, the realization that the patriarchy was no longer enough to keep a family together. The divorce now theme was the invisible antagonist of the series. As we reached the midnight hour of December 31, 1999, the American family looked nothing like it had in 1990. We had traded the myth of the nuclear family for the reality of the blended family, the single-parent household, and the digital nomad. We had legalized, medicalized, and commercialized the split. But as the ball dropped in Times Square, a new anxiety was taking hold. We had spent a decade making it easy to leave, but we hadn't spent any time making it desirable to stay. What happens to a nation that has mastered the art of the exit? In the final parts of this masterclass, we are going to look at the 1990s as the laboratory for the 21st century loneliness epidemic. We will examine how the divorce now era led directly to the rise of the hookup culture and the decline of the birth rate. We will look at the specific 2000s backlash, where a new generation tried to reinvent commitment through the lens of conscious uncoupling. But first, we must address the one thing the 90s couldn't litigate or medicate: the holiday. The 1990s changed the American Christmas forever. The imagery of the two-house Christmas became the defining visual of the era. We are going to break down the logistics of the split holiday, the travel, the guilt, and the multi-billion-dollar toy industry that thrived on the divorce guilt spending of the 90s. The math of the 90s Christmas was a zero-sum game, and the children were the ones keeping score. The next part will reveal the true cost of the happy holidays in a nation of two-house homes. The two-house holiday is perhaps the most enduring logistical legacy of the 1990s divorce now movement. If you were a child of the 90s, your December was likely defined not by a single chimney, but by the complex geometry of a custody calendar. Imagine if you are a 10-year-old named Alex in 1995. On December 24th, you are at your mother's house in the suburbs. At exactly 6 p.m., per the mediated court order, a car pulls into the driveway. This is the transition. You swap one set of traditions for another, one living room for another, and one version of family for another. This scheduled migration became a standard American ritual, and it fueled a massive economic engine that economists call guilt spending. In the 1990s, the toy industry saw a fascinating shift in historical trends. When a family unit fractures, the parents often experience a profound sense of failure, which the market is more than happy to help them mitigate through consumerism. Data from the mid-90s suggests that children of divorce often receive 20 to 30% more in total holiday spending than children in nuclear households. This wasn't because divorced parents were wealthier, it was because they were competing. This led to the rise of the double Christmas. 2 Game Boys, 2 sets of Beanie Babies, 2 mountain bikes. The retail sector in the United States essentially double-dipped on the emotional fallout of the split. For the parents, the gift was a tool for parental bonding. For the child, it was a physical manifestation of their negotiated value. Step by step, the 90s redefined the American holiday as a logistical operation. Step 1 was the negotiation of the odd and even years. Families had to decide who got Thanksgiving on even-numbered years and who got the Christmas morning slot. Step 2 was the expansion of the travel industry. The 1990s saw a surge in the number of unaccompanied minors flying across the country. Airlines like United and Delta formalized their chaperone programs to accommodate the millions of children commuting between divorced parents. Step 3 was the social normalization of the blended holiday. We began to see the rise of the step-parent as a primary holiday figure. By 1997, the imagery in commercials for companies like Folgers or Hallmark began to feature the complex, multi-layered family tree, acknowledging that the one-house Christmas was becoming a relic of the past. Let us look at a case study of the 1994 film The Santa Claus. While it is remembered as a magical comedy about Scott Calvin becoming Father Christmas, the entire narrative engine is powered by a high-conflict divorce. The tension between the biological father, the mother, and the stepfather, played by Judge Reinhold, is the emotional core of the movie. It depicts the struggle of a father trying to maintain his relevance in a world where he has been legally and socially marginalized. The film was a massive success because it spoke to the millions of American fathers who felt like guests in their own children's lives. It highlighted the 1990s fear that once the Divorce Now papers were signed, the father became a weekend visitor rather than a parent. In the year 2026, we see the long-term potential outcomes of this holiday fragmentation. The children who grew up as Alex in 1995 are now adults who often view holidays with a sense of logistical exhaustion rather than nostalgia. They are the generation that pioneered the concept of Friendsgiving, a rejection of the high-stakes, high-stress family negotiations of their youth, in favor of a chosen family that doesn't require a court-ordered schedule. The 90s didn't just change where we spent Christmas. It changed how we value the concept of home. If home is a place you leave every other weekend at 6 p.m., then home becomes a temporary state of mind rather than a permanent physical location. The 1990s also saw the emergence of the divorce-friendly vacation. Travel agencies began to market packages specifically for single parents traveling with children. This was a response to the fact that the traditional family resort was often a painful reminder of what had been lost. Disney World, in particular, became the neutral ground for many 1990s families. Historical trends show that during this decade, Orlando became a hub for the co-parenting vacation, where divorced parents would stay in separate hotel rooms but meet in the park for the sake of the kids. This created a surreal manufactured version of family life, a hyper-real performance of unity that lasted exactly as long as the park upper pass. This brings us to the psychological concept of the Disney dad, a term that gained significant traction in the 90s. It described a non-custodial father who, feeling the pressure of limited time, would eschew discipline and daily routine in favor of constant entertainment and expensive outings. This created a massive rift in the 1990s household. The custodial mother became the enforcer of homework and chores, while the weekend father became the purveyor of magic and fun. This dynamic, fueled by the Divorce Now theme, led to a generation of children who had deeply distorted views of paternal and maternal roles. The math of the split meant that the parent with less time felt they had to buy their way into the child's memory. But we must also consider the role of the grandparents. In the 1990s, the divorce of a child meant the potential loss of access to grandchildren for the elderly. This led to a surge in grandparents' rights legislation across the United States. Many states began to pass laws that allowed grandparents to sue for visitation rights after a divorce. This added yet another layer of litigation to the Divorce Now era. Imagine if you are a grandmother in 1998, and your son's ex-wife moves 3 states away. The legal battle to maintain a connection with your grandchildren became a central theme of 1990s family law. It proved that when a marriage ends, the ripples don't stop at the couple. They wash over the entire extended family, often drowning long-standing relationships in the process. The data from the end of the decade shows that by 1999, the average American child of divorce had lived in 3 different homes by the age of 18. This transient lifestyle was a direct result of the Divorce Now theme and the subsequent remarrying and redivorcing cycles of the era. Each move represented a new neighborhood, a new school, and a new set of rules. The 1990s was a decade of profound geographic instability for the American youth. While the economy was booming and the adults were finding themselves, the children were packing boxes. As we look at the year 2026, we can see that this era of constant movement created a generation that is incredibly adaptable but also deeply wary of commitment. They have seen the math of the heartbreak and they have lived the logistics of the split. They understand that a home is something that can be dismantled in a weekend. This realization changed the way Gen X and early millennials approach the housing market, the job market, and their own future marriages. We are entering the home stretch of this deep dive. We have analyzed the law, the medicine, the media, and the holidays. But there is one final frontier we haven't touched. The impact of the 1990s divorce now theme on the concept of the American dream itself. In the next part, we are going to look at the rise of the solo entrepreneur and the single-person economy. We will explore how the death of the nuclear family in the 90s paved the way for the gig economy and the rise of the digital nomad. But most importantly, we are going to look at the one specific statistic from the year 2000 that predicted the loneliness epidemic we are currently facing in 2026. The 90s gave us freedom, but it forgot to give us a plan for what to do once we were alone. The final calculation of the decade was about to be revealed, and it wasn't a number anyone wanted to see. The two-house holiday is perhaps the most enduring logistical legacy of the 1990s divorce now movement. If you were a child of the 90s, your December was likely defined not by a single chimney, but by the complex geometry of a custody calendar. Imagine if you are a 10-year-old named Alex in 1995. On December 24th, you are at your mother's house in the suburbs. At exactly 6 p.m., per the mediated court order, a car pulls into the driveway. This is the transition. You swap one set of traditions for another, one living room for another, and one version of family for another. This scheduled migration became a standard American ritual, and it fueled a massive economic engine that economists call guilt spending. In the 1990s, the toy industry saw a fascinating shift in historical trends. When a family unit fractures, the parents often experience a profound sense of failure, which the market is more than happy to help them mitigate through consumerism. Data from the mid-90s suggests that children of divorce often receive 20 to 30% more in total holiday spending than children in nuclear households. This wasn't because divorced parents were wealthier, it was because they were competing. This led to the rise of the double Christmas. 2 Game Boys, 2 sets of Beanie Babies, 2 mountain bikes. The retail sector in the United States essentially double-dipped on the emotional fallout of the split. For the parents, the gift was a tool for parental bonding. For the child, it was a physical manifestation of their negotiated value. Step by step, the 90s redefined the American holiday as a logistical operation. Step 1 was the negotiation of the odd and even years. Families had to decide who got Thanksgiving on even-numbered years and who got the Christmas morning slot. Step 2 was the expansion of the travel industry. The 1990s saw a surge in the number of unaccompanied minors flying across the country. Airlines like United and Delta formalized their chaperone programs to accommodate the millions of children commuting between divorced parents. Step 3 was the social normalization of the blended holiday. We began to see the rise of the step-parent as a primary holiday figure. By 1997, the imagery in commercials for companies like Folgers or Hallmark began to feature the complex, multi-layered family tree, acknowledging that the one-house Christmas was becoming a relic of the past. Let us look at a case study of the 1994 film The Santa Claus. While it is remembered as a magical comedy about Scott Calvin becoming Father Christmas, the entire narrative engine is powered by a high-conflict divorce. The tension between the biological father, the mother, and the stepfather, played by Judge Reinhold, is the emotional core of the movie. It depicts the struggle of a father trying to maintain his relevance in a world where he has been legally and socially marginalized. The film was a massive success because it spoke to the millions of American fathers who felt like guests in their own children's lives. It highlighted the 1990s fear that once the Divorce Now papers were signed, the father became a weekend visitor rather than a parent. In the year 2026, we see the long-term potential outcomes of this holiday fragmentation. The children who grew up as Alex in 1995 are now adults who often view holidays with a sense of logistical exhaustion rather than nostalgia. They are the generation that pioneered the concept of Friendsgiving, a rejection of the high-stakes, high-stress family negotiations of their youth, in favor of a chosen family that doesn't require a court-ordered schedule. The 90s didn't just change where we spent Christmas. It changed how we value the concept of home. If home is a place you leave every other weekend at 6 p.m., then home becomes a temporary state of mind rather than a permanent physical location. The 1990s also saw the emergence of the divorce-friendly vacation. Travel agencies began to market packages specifically for single parents traveling with children. This was a response to the fact that the traditional family resort was often a painful reminder of what had been lost. Disney World in particular became the neutral ground for many 1990s families. Historical trends show that during this decade, Orlando became a hub for the co-parenting vacation, where divorced parents would stay in separate hotel rooms but meet in the park for the sake of the kids. This created a surreal manufactured version of family life, a hyper-real performance of unity that lasted exactly as long as the park hopper pass. This brings us to the psychological concept of the Disney dad, a term that gained significant traction in the 90s. It described a non-custodial father who, feeling the pressure of limited time, would eschew discipline and daily routine in favor of constant entertainment and expensive outings. This created a massive rift in the 1990s household. The custodial mother became the enforcer of homework and chores, while the weekend father became the purveyor of magic and fun. This dynamic, fueled by the divorce now theme, led to a generation of children who had deeply distorted views of paternal and maternal roles. The math of the split meant that the parent with less time felt they had to buy their way into the child's memory. But we must also consider the role of the grandparents. In the 1990s, the divorce of a child meant the potential loss of access to grandchildren for the elderly. This led to a surge in grandparents' rights legislation across the United States. Many states began to pass laws that allowed grandparents to sue for visitation rights after a divorce. This added yet another layer of litigation to the divorce now era. Imagine if you are a grandmother in 1998, and your son's ex-wife moves 3 states away. The legal battle to maintain a connection with your grandchildren became a central theme of 1990s family law. It proved that when a marriage ends, the ripples don't stop at the couple. They wash over the entire extended family, often drowning long-standing relationships in the process. The data from the end of the decade shows that by 1999, the average American child of divorce had lived in 3 different homes by the age of 18. This transient lifestyle was a direct result of the divorce now theme and the subsequent remarrying and redivorcing cycles of the era. Each move represented a new neighborhood, a new school, and a new set of rules. The 1990s was a decade of profound geographic instability for the American youth. While the economy was booming and the adults were finding themselves, the children were packing boxes. As we look at the year 2026, we can see that this era of constant movement created a generation that is incredibly adaptable but also deeply wary of commitment. They have seen the math of the heartbreak and they have lived the logistics of the split. They understand that a home is something that can be dismantled in a weekend. This realization changed the way Gen X and early millennials approach the housing market, the job market, and their own future marriages. We are entering the home stretch of this deep dive. We have analyzed the law, the medicine, the media, and the holidays. But there is one final frontier we haven't touched: the impact of the 1990s divorce now theme on the concept of the American dream itself. In the next part, we are going to look at the rise of the solo entrepreneur and the single-person economy. We will explore how the death of the nuclear family in the 90s paved the way for the gig economy and the rise of the digital nomad. But most importantly, we are going to look at the one specific statistic from the year 2000 that predicted the loneliness epidemic we are currently facing in 2026. The 90s gave us freedom, but it forgot to give us a plan for what to do once we were alone. The final calculation of the decade was about to be revealed, and it wasn't a number anyone wanted to see. That calculation arrived with the 2000 United States Census, and it revealed a structural transformation that few were prepared to acknowledge. For the first time in American history, the nuclear family household, consisting of a married couple with children, was no longer the majority. The divorce now movement of the 1990s had successfully dismantled the primacy of the traditional home, leaving a vacuum that would be filled by the rise of the single-person household. This wasn't just a demographic shift. It was a fundamental rewiring of the American dream. In the 1950s, the dream was built on stability and collective growth. By 2000, and certainly as we look back from the perspective of 2026, the dream had evolved into a pursuit of radical autonomy. We gained the freedom to leave, the freedom to reinvent, and the freedom to exist without the friction of a partner who no longer matched our personal brand. But the data from the turn of the millennium also highlighted a rising tide of social isolation that would eventually define the 21st century. Imagine if you are a city planner in the year 2000. You are looking at a landscape where the demand for studio apartments and one-bedroom condos is skyrocketing. You realize that the divorce now theme has created a nation of individuals who are living alone, but are more connected than ever through the burgeoning digital world. This is the birth of the solo economy. In the 90s, we moved away from shared bank accounts and shared life goals toward a model of individual optimization. This led to the professionalization of the single life. Every service that a spouse used to provide, cooking, cleaning, emotional support, household maintenance, was being outsourced to a growing gig economy. The 1990s divorce boom didn't just break families. It created a market for paid companionship and domestic services that we now take for granted in 2026. Step by step, the 1990s closed with a final shift in how we perceive the end of a relationship. Step 1 was the realization that divorce was not an end, but a pivot point in a lifelong series of transitions. Step 2 was the acceptance of the serial monogamy model, where a person might have 2 or 3 major marriages in a lifetime, each serving a different developmental stage. Step 3 was the total removal of the concept of the broken home, replaced by the idea of the diverse family structure. By 2000, the language had changed. We no longer spoke about the tragedy of the split. We spoke about the logistical challenges of co-parenting. We had successfully normalized the abnormal, but in doing so, we had also lowered the bar for what we considered a successful long-term commitment. Let us look at a final case study. The legacy of 1990s television shows like Sex and the City, which reached its creative peak as the decade ended. This show was the ultimate manifesto for the post-divorce, post-nuclear world. It depicted a reality where the primary bond was no longer the marriage, but the friendship circle. It suggested that a woman's worth was not tied to her marital status, but to her professional success and her capacity for individual pleasure. For the audience of the late 90s, this was a powerful and necessary message. It provided a roadmap for how to survive and thrive in a world where the divorce now mantra was a constant reality. However, looking back in 2026, we can also see the shadow side of this narrative. It prioritized the temporary and the transactional over the permanent and the sacrificial. It taught a generation that if a relationship was difficult, it was probably just a bad fit, encouraging an endless cycle of searching for a perfect compatibility that might not exist. Historical trends show that this mindset led directly to the birth rate crisis we are analyzing today in 2026. When marriage becomes a temporary contract based on emotional fulfillment, rather than a stable foundation for raising the next generation, the incentives for having children are fundamentally altered. In the 1990s, we saw the beginning of the delayed parenting trend. People were waiting until their 30s to marry, often as a reaction to seeing their own parents' marriages fail in their 20s. They wanted to make sure they were divorce-proof. But the math showed that waiting didn't necessarily lower the risk. It just changed the stakes. The 1990s taught us to be afraid of the split, and that fear led to a more cautious, more guarded, and ultimately more isolated population. We must also consider the hidden psychological cost of the constant reinvention that the 90s demanded. We were told that we could be whoever we wanted to be, as many times as we wanted to be it. This created a culture of the restless self. The divorce now theme was just one expression of a broader 1990s obsession with the new. New careers, new technologies, new partners. This created a perpetual sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, long before the term was coined. If you stayed in a mediocre marriage, you were missing out on the potential outcomes of a new life. This pressure to constantly optimize one's happiness is a heavy burden that the children of the 90s carried into the new millennium. In 2026, we are finally seeing a counter-movement. A new generation is looking at the wreckage of the 1990s divorce now era and asking if there is a better way. They are rediscovering the value of intention and commitment, not as restrictive cages, but as protective structures. They are looking at the data on the loneliness epidemic and the long-term impacts on the children of the 90s, and they are trying to rebuild a sense of community that doesn't depend on a legal contract. The 1990s was a necessary explosion. It broke open a rigid and often hypocritical social structure, allowing for greater freedom and honesty. But like any explosion, it left a massive cleanup project for those who came after. The math of the 90s was simple. 1 + 1 is equal to 2 households. But the human math was much more complex. As we conclude this masterclass, we have to recognize that the 1990s didn't just change the divorce rate, it changed the American heart. It taught us that we are the masters of our own destiny. But it also taught us that being the master of one's destiny can be a very lonely job. We moved from the era of we to the era of me. And we are still trying to find our way back to a we that works in a digital, high-speed, and inherently unstable world. The 1990s was a decade of high-stakes experimentation in the laboratory of the American family. We tested the limits of no-fault laws, the effectiveness of antidepressants in managing heartbreak, and the capacity of children to thrive in 2 homes. Some of these experiments were successes, others were profound failures. but all of them contributed to the world we live in today. When you look at your own relationships, your own family history, and the way you view commitment in 2026, you are looking at the echoes of a decade that decided that the pursuit of happiness was worth the risk of a total collapse. But this is only the beginning of our deep dive into American cultural history. The 1990s gave us the divorce now theme, but it also gave us a new way of thinking about work, wealth, and the very nature of reality itself. In our next series, we are going to look at the other side of the 90s coin, the rise of the digital hustle and the birth of the 24/7 work culture. We will examine how the same desire for freedom that drove the divorce rate also drove the creation of the modern burnout-prone professional. If you thought the split was complicated, wait until you see what happened when we decided that we didn't just want to leave our spouses, we wanted to leave the 9-to-5 life forever. The next chapter of our masterclass will reveal the intersection of the broken home and the broken career. The 90s weren't just about breaking up, they were about breaking free, and the cost was higher than anyone predicted.